So thank you very much, Deb, for introducing me and for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I've really enjoyed the talks. I'm sorry that it's finishing, actually, because I was really enjoying it and wanting to hear more. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Yeah. So I'm a professor of theoretical physics in Oxford. This is my the street that I cycle on every day. I live just down here, and my office is right over there. Actually, this picture is from 1890, but it really hasn't changed at all. I can still... Nothing much changes in Oxford. So it's a great pleasure to be there and teach there. Being a professor of physics has other advantages, or disadvantages depending on the situation. So if you meet somebody at a cocktail party and they say, "What do you do?" and you say, "I'm a professor of theoretical physics," that usually ends the conversation. Just not so. It's nice when you're on an airplane. So I fly a lot, and I either want to sleep or work. And so somebody next to you, they say, "What do you do?" I say, "I'm a professor of theoretical physics." That usually ends the conversation. If it doesn't, I say, "I really like equations. How about you?" And if that doesn't stop them, I say, "I really like the Dirac equation. What's your favorite equation?" And if they get beyond that, then I probably should have a conversation with them. So what I want to speak about today is I'm going to talk a bit about science. I realize that this audience is quite broad. When I wrote my abstract, I had in mind really the participants in our ECF program, so I was going to do something more technical. But I'm going to do something more technical anyway, but I'm going to wave my hands a little bit more. But the main point I want to get across, the one kind of big point I want to get across, is that in this discussion about evolution, there's a very large number of hidden assumptions under the surface, the classic iceberg type paradigm. Now there are, whenever we have conversations across cultures, whether that's a religious culture, scientific cultures, or different religious cultures, different scientific cultures, we're used to the kind of superficial differences. So let me give you one actually practical example if you ever come to visit in Oxford. So in the UK, these things are called trousers. And what I wear under my trousers are what people call pants. So if you were an American and you come and you say, "I like your pants," that's really awesome. So don't do that. So that's a superficial difference between cultures. And I'm from Holland originally. I grew up in Central Africa. I lived in the US, I lived in the UK. I'm been crossing cultures, and I see these superficial differences all the time. But there are also deeper, more subtle differences. So a number of years ago, I was running an Alpha course for international students. So an Alpha course is a kind of introduction to Christianity course, and it has various talks. And there's one talk which is called "Who is the Holy Spirit?" And it's where you introduce the concept of the Trinity. And so I had a very wide range of students from a wide range of kind of backgrounds. I gave what I thought was a really good talk, very clear talk on the nature of the Trinity and who the Holy Spirit is. And one of the students, a very brilliant Indian student, came up to me and said, "Dr. Louis, I really enjoyed that talk. That was a very, very good talk." And I was feeling really good. And he said, "Now, explain to me again, how does one become a Holy Spirit?" Now, why did he think that? Well, he came from a Hindu background and the idea of God within. And so a lot of things I was saying, he just heard in a very different way. So part of what I'm going to try to tell you about when I speak about the science is sometimes when we talk about science and when we use words, we can get confused and the meanings can be conflated. So why do I, as a physicist, work on biology? I started out in quantum physics and kind of drifted over into biology. Well, one of the reasons I moved into biology is actually perhaps superficial, perhaps not. This is a movie that I saw, and this is the actual movie from Keiji Namba in Osaka. It's a bacterium. Bacterium swim with this little flagella on the back. And this is a video, it's a little animation of how the little motor that spins this flagellum works. So there you see the little proteins coming together in perfect three-dimensional symmetry. And this is an amazing little piece of nanomachinery. It can spin at 100,000 RPM. It can stop in a quarter of a turn. I have a colleague in physics who measures the torque of these things. They're absolutely spectacular little pieces of nanomachinery. If I found one that I could see and hold in my hands, I'd assume it was made in a factory. Some very complex thing made it. But these things make themselves. There is no factory inside the bacteria making these things. They just float around, and they just stick in exactly the right position every time. The first time I saw that, I thought, well, that is just amazing. How does that work? And so I asked some of my colleagues, and they said, well, they kind of waved their hands. I thought, no, that's not, no, I want to understand how that works. And so I started working on this problem of self-assembly. And in case you're bored during my talk, here's a little thought. You have 10 times more bacteria in your body than you have cells in your body. Before you rush, in fact, it's probably several pounds of bacteria that you have in your body. So before you rush off to the hospital or try to go on a quick weight loss routine, they do all kinds of good things. They synthesize vitamins most of them inside your guts. If we took them out of you, you'd be ill. In fact, we were learning that this microbiome is incredibly important to make you. So you're not just your human genome, you're also your bacterial genome. You're a combination of those two. So while I'm speaking to you, this process is happening inside of you millions and millions of times right now. And it takes about 20 to 40 minutes for it to make a machine, so roughly the time of my talk, this is happening inside of you. Now, for a physicist, the problem is that this system is way too complicated. Physicists tend to, we say that physics is really solid, hard science, and if it gets a bit fluffy, we call it chemistry. If it gets more fluffy, we call it biology. And after that, it's here be dragons. What we really mean is those problems in chemistry and biology are too difficult for us to solve, and so we just push them off to other people. And so this is too difficult, way too difficult. In fact, there's a lot we don't know about it, so I decided to work on something simpler, which are viruses. So viruses are actually also self-assemble. What they are is little shells with DNA or RNA inside, and they have these really cool little shapes. Like this first one you see is made of 12 pentagons. The next one is made of 12 pentagons and 20 hexagons. If you take a modern soccer ball, I should call it here not football, but soccer ball, round one, you'll see that they are stitched in this way. So nature got there a long time before us. And you can take these little shells, put them in a test tube, change the solution conditions, and they'll fall apart into individual little units. You change it back and they'll pop right back into a whole bunch of little balls. So that's cool. So I thought I'm going to think about that. And so I spent about 5 years with one of my PhD students working on it. And we came up with this little model here, which you see, these are little particles. They're the little virus capsids. We let them move completely randomly, so they just move randomly with no guidance at all. You just move around like they do in solution. And if you wait for a little while, you see that they spontaneously form these little shapes as we hoped they would. So that's really cool. We've understood something, at least we've been able to emulate something about this self-assembly process. And the reason it's interesting is because the number of ways that these things can come together which is wrong is hyper-astronomically large. The number of ways they can come together that's right is just one, and so it's interesting to think mathematically, how do you find that one in that very, very large set of shapes? Another way of thinking about this work, and thinking about yourself, because you're self-assembled, this is happening in your body at many different levels all the time. How does that work? Well, it's like taking Lego blocks, putting it in the box, shaking it, and out comes a fully formed train. I could do that. I could make probably a lot of money on the toy market. That's what I tell my funders when they want some kind of application for my research. I say, I'll make toys. But science is fun. And one of the great things about being a scientist today is that I'm paid money to do this. A few generations ago, I would have had to be independently wealthy to spend time thinking about this. But now I saw this movie, I thought that's interesting, I started thinking about it, and people pay me money. In fact, I should say it's mainly tax money, for which I say thank you very much to all of you here in the audience. Your taxes are paying for me to think about that. And why do we spend your tax money in that kind of slightly whimsical way? Well, it's because many of our greatest discoveries have come out of this kind of curiosity-driven research. So in case you're worried a little bit, it's not so much your taxes, all the Brits in here, it's your taxes, thank you very much. That's where it comes from. I also got interested in not only the question of how do these things assemble, but how are they designed? How do the genes make things that self-assemble? And so I started thinking a little bit about genes, and there's all kinds of interesting things about genes. So we share 15% of our genes with E. coli bacteria. We share 70% of our genes with frogs. If you kiss one and it becomes a prince, you share close to 100%. We share 98% of our genes with chimpanzees, or 96%, depending a little bit on how you count. So that's interesting. What makes us different then? In fact, my parents are biologists, and I grew up in Gabon in Central Africa. And when I was small, we had a pet chimpanzee, Bertje. In case you can't see the difference, that's the chimpanzee, and that is me. My mother says we look different, but we behave remarkably similarly. I won't start. So what makes us different is a good question. What makes us different? Well, it's not actually the number of genes. So here's number of genes and number of organisms. A bacterium has about 4,000. This little fruit fly has 13,000. These two little worms, made of only 1,000 cells, have between 19,500 and 23,500 genes. This Homo sapiens, my little daughter, has on the order of 20,000 genes, less than that little worm, which is quite amazing. And in fact, slightly worryingly, this little water flea has 30,000 genes, a lot more than my daughter or than me. And rice, which we'll be eating later today, I think, can have between 32,000 and 50,000 genes. So these simple organisms have a lot more genes than we do. So that's kind of, why is that? How can they have so many genes? Surely I'm more complicated than rice, at least I think I am. Hopefully I probably don't taste as good, but I'm more complicated. So why does it have so many genes? That's kind of interesting. Well, you can start pushing that thought a little bit further and thinking about the genes in your own body. So every single cell in your body has exactly the same DNA. But here I've got a whole bunch of different cells, a skin cell, a nerve cell, a white blood cell, a fat cell. I got a lot more of those after all the food this time at this conference. And so every single one of those cells has exactly the same DNA, but it looks completely different. So that's kind of interesting. Every cell in your body has the same DNA, but they look completely different. So how does that work? Well, so these are the three conundrums. Why are the cells in our body so different if they all have the same DNA? And why does the number of genes correlate so poorly with the complexity of an organism? And why do different organisms share so many genes? So those are kind of questions I was thinking about and I've been thinking about, and they're great puzzles, actually. It's really interesting. So why is that? Well, one of the reasons why this seems like a conundrum is because we think about genes perhaps in the wrong way. We think about them as blueprints, like architectural drawings. You can look there and grab this and it does that, and you can kind of draw and out comes the organism. But that can't quite be true because the same DNA makes all these cells that look completely different. And some very big drawings, like the drawing of rice, give something relatively simple. And some relatively small drawings, like the ones that make us, give something fairly complicated. So what's going on?
The sort of old view of how genes work is that a gene is a blueprint for making a particular part of an animal. So if there's a million different kinds of animals out there, then there should be a million different kinds of blueprints, but it's not really the case. It turns out that even in two species that look completely different, like a mouse and a housefly, they both have the same gene that says make an eye. So how come the results are so different? The basic idea is simple. Genes aren't blueprints, they're switches. Individually, they don't do much. But if you have a master switch that can turn on other switches in groups, then you can do something useful. By plugging different combinations of stuff into the same master switch, you can get different useful results that fit different needs. So that gene that says make an eye is just like this power strip. It switches other genes on in groups so that something useful can happen, like growing an eyeball. And depending on the combination of those other genes, the end result might look like this, or like this. But the master gene is always the same. And that's the connection between Evo and Devo, which lets us understand both much better. Want to grow a body part, or develop? You hit the master switch. Want to change a body part to fit a different need, or evolve? Mix up the plugs. And that wasn't so hard, was it?
So hopefully that's one piece of science you'll take with you, that genes are not blueprints, they're like switches. And just like your transistor in your computer, you can rearrange the switches that can do a wide range of different things. That's exactly how every cell in your body is different, it's because the switches are turned on and off in different ways. So here's a little picture of some of the switches in an E. coli bacterium. Every dot is a gene, every line is telling you who turns somebody on and who turns somebody off. It tells you the logical interactions between them. And what you can immediately see is the number of ways that you can draw those lines is enormous. So you can have a small number of red dots and make lots of lines and get something very complicated from this. And this is basically how it works, the logic of life. So there's something really beautiful about this kind of dance that's happening inside of you all the time with these genes turning on and off, making different things, making eyes, making all that kind of stuff. It's really something extraordinarily beautiful, much more pretty, I think, beautiful than that old-fashioned picture of a blueprint. Now, why am I interested in this? As a physicist, you may wonder. Well, it turns out that you can take this and turn it into really beautiful equations, albeit a very large number of them. And so in my lab, we're studying these equations, and we have all kinds of hopes that there's something very simple underlying them. And at the moment, those are mainly hopes, but we have some clues that there might be something underlying them. Another little interesting thing to think about in this kind of metaphor, I've given you one metaphor, genes as switches rather than genes as blueprint. That gives a much more dynamic and interesting picture. You can also think to yourself, well, could you make almost anything with DNA? Or are there certain things that are repeated? So why do we share so much DNA with other organisms, for example? Well, in the video, they described one gene that turns eyes on and off. It's called PAC6. And in fact, if you take that gene and put it in the bit of a fruit fly that makes wings, the fruit fly will try to make an eye on its wing because it switches on the eye bit. So that's actually a human eye gene they put into the wing of this fruit fly. So you can do all kinds of interesting things in this way. What this tells us that a lot of the way that we can evolve is not just by changing the genes, but by changing the way the genes are interacting with each other, by changing the little lines of logic. And the fun thing about this field, if you're interested in this, is that they have cool names like Sonic Hedgehog, Shaven Baby, and Tin Man. So maybe since I'm in the Midwest, I can ask, what do you think Tin Man is related to? Any guesses? Very good. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Tin Man who had no heart. Exactly. Very good. So Tin Man is the gene that you need to make hearts. So there's another little picture that the idea that evolution can kind of go in any direction in this kind of random way is not really true. It uses switches. It uses units that it can reshape or rechange. And there's something, I think, more pretty and interesting about that picture of evolution. Now, I've been using the word evolution slightly loosely to now. And I think really we should ask ourselves, what do we mean by the word evolution? What do we mean? Well, that's actually a really, really important question in this whole discussion because the word gets used in a very wide range of ways. And I think a lot of the confusion comes just from this kind of semantics. So the first way that evolution is used is as natural history, the idea that the Earth is old and that simpler organisms preceded more complex organisms. Now, it's important to realize that that was not what Charles Darwin was trying to describe. The knowledge that the Earth was old, the knowledge that if you dug down into the Earth, you found fossils in different layers, was known well before Darwin. So there's nothing about Darwin that's really about this. Darwin was trying to explain how it happened, but he wasn't really trying to say that it happened. And interestingly, for those of us in the church, this is the source of the vast majority of our exegetical issues. Our worries about Genesis particularly are not actually linked at all to evolution, Darwinian evolution. They are linked to natural history. So they're really linked to geology and archaeology and maybe a few related fields of that type. And those exegetical issues are pretty obvious. You don't need modern genetics to worry about them. So for example, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, were farmers. They lived in cities. In fact, there were cities out right after when Cain grew up. There were already cities around. Very clearly, that's difficult to imagine much longer than, say, 10,000 years ago, or even just by looking at archaeology. You don't need Darwin. Darwin's largely irrelevant to these kinds of worries that we have about how to interpret Genesis. And we'd be in a little bit of a pickle as Christians if the Genesis text was really maybe I would call it a journalistic reconstruction of what happened. A little bit like, if we read Luke, he starts by writing to his dear friend Theophilus to give an orderly account of what happened. If that was what the beginning of Genesis was like, then we'd be in trouble. But that's not at all what it's like. In fact, it's hugely structured in all kinds of complicated ways. And so thinkers have worried about this or thought about this or used it to bring out actually the richnesses in there for a very long time. So here's Origen, a very famous church father, slightly heterodox, who wrote almost 2,000 years ago, 1,900 years ago, "What man of intelligence, I will ask, will consider that the first and second and third day, in which there are said to be both morning and evening, existed without sun, moon, and stars, while the first day was even without a heaven? And who could be found so silly as to believe that God, after the manner of a farmer, planted trees in the paradise eastward in Eden? I do not think that anyone will doubt that these are figurative expressions which indicate certain mysteries through a semblance of history. Now, I'm not bringing this up because I'm saying we ought to agree with Origen. In fact, there's lots of things we should and perhaps shouldn't agree with Origen. I'm just pointing out that ancient interpreters immediately saw obvious things in the text, like the fact that the sun and the moon are not created to the fourth day. And one of the really interesting things about this discussion is that when I speak to an audience for whom, say, the idea that the earth is, that Genesis is a kind of literal history is very important, and I ask them how many of them have noticed that there's morning and evening, morning and evening, morning, evening, and there's no sun and moon until the fourth day. It's hard to have a morning, evening without the sun and the moon. A lot of them look puzzled because somehow they haven't noticed something absolutely glaringly obvious in the text. And if you look more carefully at the text, it has all the beautiful repeated structures at many different levels. It's very clearly a highly structured text. My wife, who came to faith later in life, first time she was told, oh, there's a problem with Genesis, she read it again and thought, she had exactly the same reaction that Origen had, which is, well, clearly this is not meant to be a journalistic retelling. That's because she came from a background with she hadn't brought up with in the church at all, had no reason to think about it in a different way. So it's really interesting to notice when you talk to people how little they've noticed these glaringly obvious things in the text. That's because we overlay onto it a modernistic way of reading. We live in a culture that believes that journalistic retelling is the highest level of truth-telling, and that's just wrong. So in Gabon, where I grew up in Central Africa, particularly in more rural areas, it's very common for a rural African person to tell you a very sophisticated story about something that happened, often not in chronological order, because they're trying to emphasize something, they're trying to say something that's really, really important. And it's not because they don't understand chronology, no, it's because they're much cleverer than that, and they're using the language to say something more important. And so why were the sun and the moon demoted to the fourth day? Well, it's obvious. People were worshipping the sun and the moon. The words that are used there are greater lamp and lesser lamp. They're physical objects in the sky rather than deities. There's a whole series of things that are being said there. They're really quite crazy. In fact, if I were to say, it's about as crazy to the audience at the time as if I were to say to you the sun and moon are in fact deities, astrological deities who control our lives, because that was what the intelligentsia thought at the time. So once you understand that, you realize the text is much more interesting and rich. And it's just fascinating to me that we get ourselves so caught up in these kinds of arguments. And I think the arguments have to do a lot less with the surface issues and a lot more with under the surface questions, a kind of a dulling of our senses for richer ways of thinking and talking about history. So that's the first question. So I think a lot of what we talked about, a lot of what my very esteemed colleagues in theology and biblical studies were describing to you are issues having to do largely with geology and archaeology. What Darwin really gave to us was a mechanism for why that change happened and how it worked. So what he said is there's variation, so you have offspring that are different from you. We actually didn't know about genetics, that came only later. So it's difference in offspring, and then that can be selected. And it's really not much more than saying something quite simple. Oh, if your offspring are different from you, and the difference makes one of your offspring have more children, and if that's heritable, then over time, the thing that makes them have more children will eventually dominate in the population. We use a very fancy word, natural selection, survival of the fittest, all those kinds of metaphors, but really all it is a little piece of mathematics. If one of my children has 2 children, and their children have 2 children each, and one of my children has 4 children and 4 children, then after the next generation of 2 grandchildren, one's had 4 on the next one, 16, 8. It grows much, much more quickly in one stream than the other. That's what survival of the fittest really is. And that was a brilliant idea that he came. Of course, it has a lot of implications for how life is connected together, how it's related to one another, but fundamentally that's the principle. And Christians, by and large, are very happy with this principle. So, for example, as I'll show a bit later, this is the principle that your immune system uses to have a small number of genes to be able to respond to a very large number of different pathogens. It uses a method of random variation. It randomizes antibodies in order to grab onto antigens. We see this in bacteria all the time. We see bacteria can evolve all kinds of different things. So Christians all agree that God created this mechanism, The only difference is that Christians may disagree often about whether this mechanism explains the change over time that we see in the fossil record, for example. And I think that's an interesting question. Does it explain it? Does it not explain it? It's a scientific question to some sense. It's not, to me, obvious that it directly has a lot of exegetical, biblical implications once you think about it a little bit more. What it does have implications for is kind of natural theology. So natural theology, the idea that I look at nature and extract some knowledge about the divine, there it does have an implication, or it seems to at least, and it's partially because of the words that are used, words like random, purposeless, survival of the fittest, which I just mentioned to you before. So I'm going to go back and touch on this a little more and explore it. So that's evolution number 2, evolution as a mechanism to describe change over time. Everyone agrees, including most Christians, that that is something that God created. The question is that enough to explain the large-scale change over time? That's an interesting question. The third kind of evolution is evolution as a big picture worldview, a kind of linked to scientism. This is like the quote from George Gaylord Simpson that Jeff used yesterday. Man is the result of a purposeless and materialistic process that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. Or Richard Dawkins, perhaps the world's most famous natural theologian. He looks at nature and says a lot of things about the way the world ought to be, or the way the world is, or the way God does or doesn't exist. But he says, essentially, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, my own take on this would be, and I'm going to say this very briefly, you can ask me more in the questions, is that Gaylord Simpson, Dawkins, and the vast majority of popularizers of this type engage in a really naive and populist kind of natural theology. Extremely simplistic. And so they look at the natural world and then say, oh, this tells me something about what God is like. What happens in that case is they're often thinking about God as some kind of, if God exists, the God they don't believe in is a kind of anthropomorphized God, an animal like us, only bigger and smarter. Well, that's not the God that I believe in. That's not the God of classical theology. God who is the sustainer and creator of all worlds is not an animal like us, not somebody who's like us, but just a little bit smarter. It's someone completely and utterly different. And I think that the way that the dynamics of the rhetoric work in our Christian circles goes a little bit like this. You, an ordinary person in the pews, hear a popularizer of biology make evolutionistic, scientific claims, like man is the result of a purposeless process. You think that's wrong because we're made by God, and I would say you're entirely right. And so you think, well, that guy must be wrong. The danger is if you then try to attack his science, thinking that by attacking his science you're going to undermine his philosophical arguments, you're actually kind of playing into his hands.
I'm not sure what you said.
Sorry. Okay. So maybe to repeat that again. But I think that's essentially the dynamic. So I think people are rightly incensed by the way that natural theology plays in. You see that in secondary schools, the way that the average non-Christian high school biology teacher teaches biology, they smuggle this stuff in left, right, and center, and it's incredibly unhelpful. And the reason why it's so powerful is because it uses a very naive kind of populistic natural theology that's also shared by the average person on the street, whether they do or don't believe in God. And so it's kind of it's two sides that are holding each other up. I think it would be much more helpful if Christians had instead responded by saying, well, look, whether or not evolution 1 or evolution 2 are true, the conclusions you're drawing from it don't at all follow in the way they do. And if you cut that, I think our discussions would be a lot less fraught and a lot less, we'd be a lot more relaxed about thinking about these kinds of things. So let me just give you one example of this kind of scientism, I call it, and actually an example that doesn't link to evolution at all, because I think it doesn't really matter whether you undermine natural selection. Someone would come around tomorrow and say, I've shown that Charles Darwin was wrong all along. Variation and natural selection don't explain the change over time. It's not going to change this problem that we have with evolutionism or scientism. So here's a very great biologist and physicist, actually, originally Francis Crick. In one of his recent books, not too long before he died, he wrote, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more, I'll call this nothing but, the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. This is the classic kind of shibboleth of scientism. You're nothing but the things that you're made of. And this is essentially what evolutionism is about. You're nothing but the product of a process over time, which has random and all kinds of other metaphors attached to it. The question is that true? Does even Francis Crick believe that? So I'm going to have a little, with due apologies to the Crick estate, I'm going to have a little thought experiment on Francis Crick. So Francis Crick, imagine the lights are low. He's sitting up at the top of that beautiful place we were yesterday, looking out, but he's got it all for himself, because if you have no price, you have a lot of money, you can take it for yourself. There's a beautiful young lady that he's trying to woo. And at some point she says to him, Francis, we've been together for quite a long time, but do you really know who I am? Do you know what I'm made of? Now all the men in the audience will realize this is a very dangerous question. Normally you try to steer the conversation away and distract, but it doesn't work, and she keeps pushing on Francis. And Francis says, okay, I do know what you're made of. You're made of chemicals. In fact, the average human has enough phosphorus for 2,000 matches, enough iron for 1 nail, enough chlorine to disinfect one swimming pool, and enough fat for 10 bars of soap. At this point, he would probably get a slap. If he tries to dig himself out by saying, well, no, I meant 0.1 bars of soap, he's not going to get any further. And the reason is obvious, because you're not nothing, you are made of chemicals, but you're not nothing but the chemicals you're made of. There's many different levels of meaning that we attach to ourselves as people. And I don't think that Francis would do that, Francis Crick would have done that, because I don't think he's a consistent thinker in these kinds of ways. What's another example of why it's difficult to extract meaning from nature? Let me give you another example that's more recent. So here's a very famous quote in Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Genes. Genes swarm in huge colonies, safe inside gigantic lumbering robots, sealed off from the outside world, communicating with it by tortuous indirect routes, manipulating it by remote control. They are in you and me. They created us body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. So here you see a very kind of classic nothing buttery type of argument being played out. But here's the interesting point. Even if you were to believe this, is nature that unambiguous? Can you interpret it so easily? So here's Dennis Noble, who was in fact, as another famous biologist in Oxford, was in fact Richard Dawkins' thesis examiner, in a book that he wrote in 2006 called The Music of Life, which is actually looking at, among others, the beauty of the interconnectedness of all the genes that I showed you earlier. He said, well, I can just take that same metaphor and turn it upside down. Genes are trapped in huge colonies, locked inside highly intelligent beings, molded by the outside world, communicating with it by complex processes, through which blindly, as if by magic, function emerges. They are in you and me. We are the system that allows their code to be read, and their preservation is totally dependent on the joy that we experience in reproducing ourselves. We are the ultimate rationale for their existence. And Dennis tells me that he's asked Richard, can you find an experiment that would adjudicate between these two interpretations, which are radically different? And there is none. And that's just an example to show you that doing this kind of natural theology is very, very difficult. It's highly, the interpretation is highly ambiguous. And that's not a new idea. You see very famously, probably the most famous and brilliant theologian of the 19th century in Britain was John Henry Newman, who said on this topic, I believe in design because I believe in God, not in God because I see design. And more recently, Alistair McGrath has tried to kind of revamp natural theology and as a way of seeing. And the arguments really are that there is no view from nowhere. You always look at the world from a particular point of view, and so you tend to interpret it from that point of view. And therefore, theologians like Newman or Barth or many others have been hugely suspicious of the natural theology project, particularly of the naive populist versions of it, because almost always what we're reading into nature or out of nature is what we ourselves put into it. And that is fundamentally the problem with a very large amount of our kind of science popularizing. It's a kind of natural theology that puts into the world what they've already thinking in the first place. Instead, what Alistair has been trying to do to reinvigorate it a little bit is to use a phrase from C.S. Lewis, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And the argument would be, if I start from a Christian way of thinking about the world and I look at the natural world, does it resonate better with that way of starting than if I start from a purely metaphysically naturalistic way? There is nothing but atoms and molecules. Does that make more sense of the world? And that way you might be able to do some kind of natural theology, but what you can't do is look at it and unambiguously interpret it. So that's the second kind of point I really wanted to make for you, that natural theology is difficult and that a lot of our problems with evolution have to do with some natural theological interpretations by Christians and non-Christians. In the last bit, I want to talk a little bit about the word random. So, Charles Darwin, why on earth did you use the word random, is my lament. And the reason for that is because the word random is actually, has all kinds of overtones. Purposeless is the most common one, but there's a whole series of other things. I'm not random. If you say to the average person, you are made by random mutations, they don't like that. Random seems to have no meaning, no direction, no purpose at all. Now, Christians could still easily live with a lot of randomness. There's a lot of it has to do with how you think about God's sovereignty. There's definitely examples in the scripture of using the word random, very famously. I won't give the example actually, but there's examples of it in scripture. I want to give you a few examples why that word is perhaps more complicated than we have to think about. So here's a piece of biology. So proteins are long polymer chains, they're like strings in your body. But if they're long strings, they can flop around, they don't really do that much. What you want them to do is to fold into this well-defined three-dimensional structure. And what they do, amazingly, is they can fold into exactly the same structure, or almost the same structure, many times over and over again, repeatedly. And you might think, well, that's cool. But take a piece of string, rub it in your hands, and see if you get exactly the same shape each time. You don't. You get something different every single time. So this is called the Leventhal paradox by Cyrus Leventhal, a biophysicist at MIT, who pointed out that if you just take, say, a string of 150 amino acids, which is a small protein, and assume that between every single unit you can have maybe 10 different angles, there's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, 10 to the 150 different possibilities. The time it would take to search all those possibilities is longer than the age of the universe, so clearly there's a paradox. So how does that work? And in fact, if we only found our proteins fully formed, then this paradox would seem very powerful and an almost unassailable argument for the fact that God had to do miracles in natural history in order to make these things. But that's not what happens. We can do these experiments, and what we think is that, in fact, the reason why these proteins can always find the same shape is because that search through all possible configurations is not random at all. What happens when you pose the question, like Leventhal does, is that it's a little bit like saying this, like having a golf course and a blind golfer who's trying to hit a hole. Now, if the hole is here on this flat bit, then the probability that he'll hit that hole with a random whack is indeed extremely small. So that's a truly random search, and it wouldn't actually happen. But what we think happens, is that the proteins are more like at the bottom of a little free energy funnel. So as long as you hit the ball somewhere here, doesn't matter where you hit it, it'll always roll down to the bottom. If only golf was that easy. But you see what I'm saying? So the search is actually not random. The search is not in a random at all. And so the reason why that paradox has its power is because an assumption has been slipped in under the rug that the search is random. That's not true. The search is not random. And in fact, in that picture I showed you of those self-assembling virus capsids, that's exactly the method that I use. I use this kind of energy landscape method to design my capsids. And as I said before, this is also the system that your immune system uses random variation to bind to antigens. Now, what I wish Charles Darwin would have done is not use the word random, but use a technical term called stochastic. So for those of you not scientists, stochastic is a term that physicists and mathematicians and engineers use for processes that are random in one way or the other. It's random that we don't know what the outcomes are. And in fact, it'd be much better to say that we have stochastic mutations, stochastic variation, that is then selected upon. In fact, the interesting thing is if you're any kind of engineer or a physicist or mathematician, you'll know that if you try to calculate a complicated integral by just normal quadrature, as the number of variables grows, the dimensions gets larger and larger, you it gets harder and harder and harder to solve the problem. What you can do is use random methods like Monte Carlo methods, where you randomly flip a certain thing and then you select on it. And if you do that, well, you can solve much larger, more complicated problems. So it's classically used all the time in physics and engineering. In fact, it's used to price your stock portfolio. It's used to design bridges. It's used to design buildings. It's used everywhere. That's a stochastic process. And it turns out that that process is the most efficient way of solving these high-dimensional problems. So given that that's the way the world works, it's not that surprising that if God were to create the world, he would use a stochastic process, because it is in fact the most efficient way of searching through a very high-dimensional space, which is what evolution essentially does. So, although I said you shouldn't anthropomorphize God, if God were to create a world that makes itself, then that would be the way that you would do it. So if I think back to my Lego analogy, imagine I give you a fully formed train. You might think it's cool, but if I give you that box that I shake, and out comes a fully formed train, even if the train has a few scratches on it and maybe one or two pieces missing, it would still be much cooler. And effectively, it's a stochastic process would be the one that makes it. So that suddenly, if only Charles Darwin had used the word stochastic variation, I think a lot of our worries, and in fact a lot of the kind of metaphysical implications that people like Gaylord Simpson and others attach to evolution would partially at least fade away. I'm getting close to the end of my talk, and I want to talk about one more type of non-randomness in evolution, very briefly. This is more for the people that are really interested in the experts in it, which is, in the classical argument for evolution, there's two steps: variation and natural selection. And Darwin didn't really know where variation came from. It was partially rediscovered by my countryman Hugo de Vries, who rediscovered Mendelian genetics. And he pointed out that natural selection explains the survival of the fittest, but does not describe the arrival of the fittest. It doesn't describe how mutations give you a particular kind of variation, of things that you can select. And in the classical modern synthesis, which is a fancy word for combining genetics and Darwinian evolution, for a long time people thought that evolution was primarily a natural selection, so that variation was largely unordered and isotropic, so it could go in any direction more or less with equal probability. So if you have a mutation, your offspring are equally likely to be taller or shorter than you. If the population gets taller over time, that's because selection has selected it. What a number of us have been saying is that perhaps that's not true. Perhaps some mutations are much more likely to make you go one direction than the other. And then given that the variation is highly biased, then it may be that in fact some of the changes you see over time have to do with the structure of variation. I'm going to skip over some of the slides which are a bit more complicated, but I'll just show you one. So one thing we do know is that many mutations are neutral, that is to say they don't do anything to the phenotype, to the outcome that we know of. In fact, that's what we use to get phylogenetic trees. We look at neutral mutations. So if I look at the space of all possible genotypes, all possible sets of genes, there's a lot more of them than there are possible outcomes. And so the question that a lot of us have been asking is, if I look at the set of all possible genes and the set of all possible outcomes, are they more or less equally distributed, or do a certain subset of outcomes have the vast majority of genes mapping to them? And that would be a different kind of non-randomness. That would be saying that even though the mutations are random, the outcomes that natural selection can work on may not be random. And I'm going to jump. I put some extra slides in just in case I would have extra time, but of course I don't. And so what I just want to tell you is that if you want to read more about this, there's a really wonderful book that's just come out by someone I know very well, Andreas Wagner at the University of Zurich, who's not a theist by any stretch of the imagination, but a very, very good scientist who looks at this question of the arrival of the fittest. And in my own work, I've been working on these questions and claiming that a large number of the patterns that we see, at least in simple systems, can be explained by the non-random variation. Whether this has any impact on natural theology, I don't think so, except that hopefully it will weaken the strength which some of my naturalistic colleagues use the randomness of variation to make metaphysical claims. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. So if you want to read more about that and you're interested in evolution and its details, then I'd recommend Andreas's book. And if you're really into nitty-gritty, you can look at my 2 most recent papers. All right, so in conclusion, the first thing I wanted to let you know is that science is fun. That evolution is beautiful, I think. I hope I show you something about that's really beautiful and interesting. That metaphor should be used with care. Particularly the word random, I think, should be replaced with the word stochastic, and that would soften some of our arguments. And I also think that we probably don't understand enough about evolution to do very much natural theology, even if we are so inclined. And last but not least, I want you to remember that these are trousers and not pants. Thank you very much. Thank you.